Okay, so this presentation has to do with how we deal with stormwater pollution and flooding in Maryland, but much of this also applies to the United States in general. So water is a very powerful earth mover. We know, those of us who have studied geomorphology, about how water created the mountains and the valleys, but on a much shorter time scale, it also moves a lot of earth. The raindrops fall quickly, hit the ground, and detach soil particles with them. And these impacts then multiplied by many times, and with runoff, carries a lot of sediment pollution. And of course, if there's any chemicals or other pollutants, those go right along with it into the stormwater. And then that flows down to the area where the flow settles down and sediments settle out and can cause all kinds of problems in streams and reservoirs. And when it concentrates, as stormwater runoff is a very powerful force. This is a picture not too far from here during a rainstorm, and that sediment washes down, and low parts of the road can cause flooding, and certainly flooding in homes and communities. And that force of water erodes the stream channels and picks up even more sediment. And this is a picture of one of our drinking water reservoirs, which has accumulated a lot of sediment. Now we're losing drinking water reservoir capacity, and of course the pollution from stormwater traveling with that as well. And also Chesapeake Bay. This is the Severn River, and we're not too far from here right now in Annapolis, and the Severn is right out at the end of the street, and this is what it looks like sometimes after a bad rainstorm. So I think we've all probably seen this, and we know that this is a serious source of pollution to our streams, lakes, and bays. So controlling runoff and sedimentation and all the pollution that goes with it involves a number of different steps. Maintaining vegetative cover, the trees and grass and buffers definitely help keep the soil in place. Designing with nature, not paving over streams, and realizing that the water needs to have a place to go. And through design attributes, maintaining vegetative cover, we need to decrease the volume and velocity of the water in stormwater runoff and provide areas for settlement and filtration of pollutants. So we have in Maryland erosion and sediment control program. This is also Federal Clean Water Act requirement, so most states have similar programs, but Maryland's, I have to say, is one of the most aggressive among all the states. If you go just north of here to Pennsylvania, you will find that the erosion and sediment control is not as aggressively dealt with as it is here. But there are a number of different parts of this: designing with nature, preserving as many trees as possible, putting in roadways in areas that are at tops of hills and not areas where the stream is going to be running and things like that, allowing places for the water to go. When you do disturb the ground, revegetate it as quickly as possible. You see this machine here, there's straw on the cart, and it gets fed into the machine, and the straw gets blasted out over bare areas with seed and fertilizer in it. So the seed and fertilizer go down, the grass can start to grow, and the straw lays on top to protect it from erosion until the grass takes hold. And we have stabilization requirements within a week to 2 weeks, depending on the size of the area being opened up. You've got to have straw and grass and the ground stabilized to prevent erosion. And then all construction sites have silt fence around them to try to keep the soil as close to the source area as possible, and that intercepts the sediment and holds it there. And also you've got the silt fence, and then you see in the curb area here, it's not very clear in the picture, but there are rocks and filter cloth in the curb as well. There's a storm drain here, and that filter cloth and the rocks filter out sediment to keep it out of the waterway as well. And these are just a few examples. We have many practices that are required, and every construction site has to get an erosion and sediment control plan approved to prevent erosion and control sediment. And this is diversion of water, clean water around the site, providing drainage away from the area that's being disturbed. And then typically at the bottom, final step, retention trapping. You see sediment ponds on all construction sites around the state to capture the last part of the sediment, but things still get out, as you might imagine. It's not a perfect system. So Maryland law requires this, and it has, you have to prevent the pollution of state waters with sediment, and Maryland was actually one of the first states to consider sediment as a pollutant. An additional feature of Maryland's law, not only can you not put it into the waters of the state, but you cannot place it in a position or location likely to be washed into the water of the state. So even if it's not raining, if I take a big pile of sediment and put it next to the stream and don't take measures to prevent it from running off, I can get a penalty for that, even if it doesn't rain that particular day, because you know it's going to rain eventually, and then you're going to have a problem. So the law is very specific about that. The Department of the Environment implements and supervises the program, establishes the procedures and standards, and reviews local ordinances. And so it's the local government, the county, the municipality, that actually implement the law, but it's overseen by the state. And we also, at the state level, make sure that the local governments have adequate enforcement programs in place, and that the erosion and sediment control plans are properly reviewed, properly being done. And this is required not only for businesses, but also for state and federal projects. So the Department of Defense has to get erosion and sediment control permits, and the state highway agency has to. Nobody's exempt from these rules. And in the U.S., we have what are called soil conservation districts, which were established in agricultural parts of the country back in the Dust Bowl in the 40s, 1940s, to keep soil on cropland. And those soil conservation districts are in every county in the United States, and they have also taken on the responsibility for making sure that soil is kept in place on new development in urban, suburban areas as well. So it's both an agricultural and urban-suburban requirement. And we provide training and certification to the people who run these programs, and they have to take a test, and it's not very hard, but at least there's something in place to require people to understand what they need to do. And the local government, of course, puts all of the ordinances or local laws in place and makes sure that the work is done. So water quality, of course, is impacted by stormwater runoff as well. And this simple diagram from the Maryland Design Manual just shows that in a natural environment, you have a pretty good balance between surface runoff and groundwater flow and rainfall and evapotranspiration. When you develop an area, it gets hotter, you get a larger evapotranspiration component, a larger surface runoff component because of the paving, and not as much groundwater. So it's more of a surface runoff problem. And this is what we want to try to correct when we develop, is try to get back to this picture instead of that picture. So there are a lot of different things that we do. This slide just says that there's all kinds of things that wash down the storm drain. So a big component of stormwater runoff pollution prevention is to clean the streets and pick up the trash and make sure it doesn't go down the storm drain. And so there's a big component of our stormwater pollution control permits that require areas to be kept clean so it doesn't run off. The extra stormwater runoff causes a lot of erosion in streams, widening and sediment deposition, destroys the stream habitat. One of the components of our restoration effort in Chesapeake Bay is to restore streams that have been damaged by runoff, correct the runoff problem, and then go in and fix the stream to try to restore it to its more natural functioning ecosystem service. And stormwater runoff, of course, causes flooding, and this, do you recognize this?
Yes.
This is actually in Rio.
Yes.
One night when we were out in the center, we went to a restaurant. There was a storm event, and we came out, and the street was totally full of water. But this could have been Ellicott City here in Maryland just a few months ago. We had a huge storm event with flooding in the streets, and actually a couple of people even drowned. So this is not a unique problem for Rio. This is something that we're all fighting with. But the way we're trying to deal with it, at the federal level, there's a big emphasis on what we call green infrastructure, or GI. And this is the use of more vegetation, vegetated roofs, more parkland, areas where water can be captured in the city, and try to reduce the amount of impervious surface to keep the stormwater on the land and reduce the runoff. Of course, that's very difficult to do in a city, but EPA has put out this book from 2016 with a lot of solutions for downtown and infill locations at the address you see there at the bottom. And the kinds of things we're talking about, we call them rain gardens, permeable soils, pavements, green roofs. So here's a little rain garden. You see the roof drainage going into the stones with the vegetation to try to infiltrate into the ground and evaporate. The green roof captures the water on top of the building, and these street side rain gardens, the runoff from the street goes in there. And then it gives the water an opportunity to be filtered, captured, evapotranspirated, but it's also got under drains so that it won't flood. When it gets up to a certain level, it will runoff. So these things have to be designed properly and they have to be maintained to do their job and prevent flooding. And then living shorelines. A lot of the areas around Chesapeake Bay are rapidly eroding. And a couple of years ago, Maryland passed a law that said wherever possible, you have to put in place a living shoreline rather than having the riprap stone right up against the shore. You put a little bit offshore, you allow spaces for the water to get through, establish wetland vegetation, and we call that a living shoreline. There are many different variations of this, and this is from Chesapeake Bay Trust, which is an organization that funds a lot of these projects. And actually a portion of their money comes from the sale of special license plates on cars. If you look at some of the cars around, like mine, you'll see Chesapeake Bay license plates on them, and we pay an extra fee which goes to the trust to help fund projects like this. And so there are many benefits of green infrastructure listed here, and I'm not going to read through them all, but in general, improving water quality and reducing water use, recharging groundwater, preventing flooding. In the climate change area, reducing air temperatures in developed areas and reduce energy use, associated greenhouse gas emissions. These are all very positive things for the city and very popular in cities like Baltimore, Washington, Philadelphia. A lot of people are interested in having these in their communities. And then, believe it or not, even in the cities, improved wildlife habitat, the birds and so forth, much better opportunity there. And something that people don't think about a lot, but has been a major factor in Maryland are green jobs. We have trouble getting enough qualified engineers to design and oversee the building of these types of facilities. So there are lots of employment opportunities, and we're building up the infrastructure to do that. And of course, increased property values, just better quality of life, better community. People want to live near these kinds of things. So in Maryland, we require what's called environmental site design on all new development and redevelopment. If you go into a city and redevelop an area that historically had been paved, you have to put some green infrastructure in. So this is actually a picture of the Department of the Environment headquarters, and we have a green roof in the center of the building and parking lot islands that are designed to capture and treat some of the runoff. We also have excess runoff goes into cisterns under the parking lot, and it gets pumped to the roof of the building, and it's used to flush toilets in the building. So there are a number of green features that can be put into buildings to try to make better use of stormwater. And actually, Los Angeles, California is one of the big forerunners in this whole area of stormwater reuse. So you see, these are some shots from Maryland, some rain gardens, permeable pavement. Environmental site design. When you go in to a new area to develop a new development, we have a special requirement now called environmental site design to make sure you take into account waterways and stream buffers in designing your development using the natural drainage pathways, and it goes through a concept review and then a final plan review to try to make sure that all of our new developments are built to take as much possible use of environmental and site design and green infrastructure on the projects. And the kinds of things: expanding, enhancing stream buffers, reducing impervious surface, a lot of different things that I've mentioned. These permeable pavers are actually quite effective. I have one in my driveway at home, and I have rain barrels that capture the runoff from my roof. I've got 3 60-gallon tanks in my driveway, and all the runoff goes in there. And I can open all 3 of them up at once, and the water gets 5 feet down my driveway before it's gone. It's absorbed into the permeable pavement. So I've been really pleased with the way it's worked. You never get runoff from it. It goes into the ground. So there are a lot of things like that, and no one measure works in every case. It's a mix and match what works best, but taken together can be quite effective. And in redevelopment, where there's an existing urban area with a lot of pavement, the requirements are not quite as stringent, recognizing that it would be difficult to do that and expensive, but we allow alternatives of off-site mitigation. So if you're redeveloping an area, you can't quite get to the standard 50% with environmental site design, the local government can establish a fund that you can pay into, and then that fund would be used for other projects in other areas to mitigate for what you've not been able to do on your site. So we try to build in a lot of this kind of feature into flexibility. And then smart coastal growth, there are a lot of reasons why these kind of practices are valuable in the coastal area. The living shorelines tend to stand up better to hurricane-type flooding, because what happens when a bulkhead or a riprap gets overtopped by a flood, as the water rushes back, it can't get out, it destroys the riprap or the bulkhead. With a green living shoreline, the wetland plants can absorb a lot of that energy, and then they can filter back out, and there are gaps in the structure to allow it to go out. So we actually see that these things hold up better in some of the coastal flooding situations. So it's been very successful. And smart growth and the idea of making more compact development, leaving more open space, is also a better way to allow you to protect property from flooding and a lot of the issues associated with climate change. So again, there's it's blocked by the computer screen, but there's a link to this page. Hopefully we can make sure that's clear in the final production. But in any case, these are there's a lot of documentation that's available to pursue these things. And of course, stormwater carries trash. I don't know if you've been to Arroyo Fundo River Treatment Unit. It's over in the eastern part of, western part of Rio. The name of the community is escaping me right now, but yeah. So in any case, this is one of the eco barriers and trash removal operation that we saw when we were over there. And of course, a big flood can carry a lot of stuff down. But again, this is not unique to Rio. This is actually the middle branch of Baltimore Harbor. So we're not certainly immune to this problem, but we have a very innovative solution which we think can provide a lot of benefit here and many other places around the country, and we're working hard on this. And it's called the trash wheel, and it's basically the river current pushes this wheel, and there's a conveyor here that picks the trash up and puts it in, and this boom here collects the trash, and there's a dumpster on here which can be removed and dumped, and this thing removes tons and tons of trash from the Baltimore Inner Harbor. I showed you the middle branch. This is the area that's protected by the water wheel, and this was a big spring storm before the water wheel went in, similar spring storm after the water wheel went in. Huge difference in the amount of trash being picked up, tons and tons of trash. And you can see some other shots of Baltimore Inner Harbor. If you haven't been there yet, I'm sure you'll see these. So we are working towards putting another one of these into the middle branch of the harbor to deal with that problem I showed you before. But it's been a very successful device. And we actually, in our work in Rio, looked at suitable locations for this in Guanabara Bay watershed, and each of the dots are spots that have been suggested for or where eco barriers had been installed already. And these could be modified with the addition of a water wheel to reduce trash flow into Guanabara Bay. And this is just one of the sites that we looked at, and we put together these materials to show how it could potentially be used in the Rio area as well. So no matter what you do to control stormwater, you're still going to have flooding. And in the U.S., we have a national flood insurance program, and this is from their webpage, just a picture of a woman standing in her living room with boots on and a couple of inches of water all over her floor. And so flood insurance is required in the U.S. We have mapped all of our waterways, floodways, floodplains nationwide. Properties in the floodplain that are likely to be flooded have to have insurance. Floodplain, local governments have to have ordinances in place to protect people from flooding. And then construction, any construction in a waterway or floodplain has to get a permit to ensure that it is not going to make the flooding worse or cause situations either upstream or downstream flooding to occur. And so we have mapped the whole country. This is just Baltimore showing the Jones Falls and the Inner Harbor. I was talking about the Inner Harbor. This is where the water wheel operates. The middle branch is the area where we saw all the trash. It doesn't have a similar device in place, but you see the blue is the floodplain along the Jones Falls, and you can zoom in on this and you can see the individual buildings and streets. And actually my son bought a house recently a little bit further up the Jones Falls, and I used this to make sure that he was outside of the floodplain. But this is very important. And if you look at this closely, you can see that a lot of the flooded areas are left in open space so that you don't have damage to property. And we actually have, after repeated floodings, the federal government and state will provide grants to buy homes or businesses that are repeatedly flooded, pay market rate for them to find another location, and then that property reverts to some kind of an open space situation to prevent flooding in the future. And just another, this one I'm showing down the Inner Harbor area. If you go down there, the aquarium's right down here just off, but this shows you the area to be flooded in a 100-year storm event in downtown Baltimore. And there are a lot of buildings in there that would be inundated. So we've got a lot of work to do to deal with this, but we put the tools in place to try to reverse years and years of ignoring these kind of problems. So that's the stormwater story, and that's a picture of one of my friends on the Susquehanna River in their kayak heading downstream. It was a flooding day, so the water's kind of murky, but it was still fun. So that's the stormwater story. I don't know if you have any questions, comments.